Hey everybody, welcome to this video. This is part 2 in a series where we're diving into how to build this scorecard dashboard. This is a dashboard that in part 1 we really got into discussing. This is something that I've put together for my Data Dev Day talk on May 20th. By the way, don't miss it. Check that out. And so for this dashboard, just a quick recap. This is looking at cryptocurrency price data, and it's doing so in this kind of scorecard fashion where we really just care about how are these different cryptocurrencies performing over different time intervals. And we've also built this to be PDF printout friendly. That's why we have all this text over here on the right. This is essentially repeating the information you would get from a tooltip. But if we print this out to PDF, as we will be doing in my Data Dev Day talk, we don't have the tooltip. So that's why we see this here. Now, this dashboard is going to be very modular in how all the different pieces come together. And so this is something that in this video, we're going to dive into a little bit. We're going to look underneath the hood and we're going to see why do we go about designing a dashboard like this in a modular fashion to where each of these different components are kind of their own thing? What are some of the benefits of doing things that way? And then how do you actually start to bring that to life by the very first step, which is opening Tableau Desktop and beginning to build your data source? So before we build the data source, it's worth pointing out to you that all of the data that I'm going to be using here and that this dashboard uses, there's a video on how to generate that data for yourself. So you can go out to my YouTube channel, and this will actually be linked in the description of this video, but there's a video called Getting Historical Crypto Prices for Free Using Python and Tableau's Hyper API that you can check out and follow along, and you'll end up with the exact same hyper extract file that I have in this video. So with that said, let's hop into Tableau Desktop and let's take a look at this finished product and rehash on this thing I keep mentioning, which is that things are kind of components and independent. Now, what I really mean by that is that if I look at this daily section and I click on this, we see this box appears, and each one of these different time periods where I'm comparing how we did, this month compared to last month, or this quarter versus last quarter. All of these are what I refer to as components, in the sense that if I were to drill down into that component, we could see, oh, this is really just exactly what we saw out here contained within this box. This isn't some kind of fancy worksheet that's doing the daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly all at the same time. And I actually wouldn't want this dashboard to be designed that way. I want this to be really independent in terms of how these components behave, so that if there is any kind of change I need to make, I don't need to change everything. I could change just the specific thing that needs to be changed. Now you could, just to play devil's advocate, you could say, well, what if you need to change the same thing about all of these? Well, that's a valid point, but more often than not, what you're going to encounter is that when you're putting your dashboard into production, the people you're getting feedback from, your end users, they're going to want to change specific things about a dashboard to make it usable to them in the business environment. And you could take the stance of, sorry, boss, I'm using this technology and there are limitations to it and we can't do that change for you. Or you could actually use the tool to its maximum potential. And in this case, I strongly believe that to use Tableau to its maximum potential, you're going to want to take certain design considerations up front and implement them in a way that's going to leave the door open for you to be more flexible. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the underlying data source looks like. So over here on the left side of the screen, we have my data pane, and we can see that I have Some things here like my original dates, my original dimensions, and my original measures. So just to keep things simple in this video and not overwhelm you with too much information at once, let's focus on these things because these are things that we're going to see when we connect to our data for the first time. So if we go into a new instance of Tableau Desktop and we connect to that data that we created, that hyperfile, by the way, this is what's the output from that YouTube video I pointed out earlier. Now, if we open this and we go into a sheet view, we can see over here on the left, we have a data pane. We do not have folders, but we do have all of these original fields that I'm calling out over here. So let's just talk about this a bit. First of all, why folders? Maybe I can just demonstrate this for you. If I don't group by folder, then I'm really kind of hoping that my naming, my variable naming strategy is really good. Like in this case, I'm quite consistent with how I name things. That's just years of practice. And so this isn't even that terrible, but it is probably not quite as good as if I group things by folder. Now, one of the advantages you're going to get from grouping things by folder is that it's easy to collapse these folders so that you can much more quickly find what you care about and expand it. So if I know that I care about like, I have some broken logic for my current week, I need to fix that. Well, here we go. Now I'm focusing on all of these metrics that deal with my current week's data. Also, why am I building out different folders here for my current day, month, quarter, week, and year? If you're very good with Tableau, you're already familiar with the idea of being able to drag like a date out into columns and then drag your numerical field out into rows, and then you could change what type of date we're looking at. Like for example, if I bring this out here, we're looking at years, but we could look at quarters, months, days. Why am I baking this into my fields out here? Well, this plays into just this design pattern that I have when I want to build these components. So I want my yearly component to be very focused in on just yearly data. So I build fields that encapsulate that yearly data, as opposed to using date as a filter. This has a lot of advantages in terms of flexibility. It does take a little bit more effort in terms of building things out at the beginning, but it's a trade-off that I really strongly feel is worth it. I'll leave that up to you. Now, all of this is, opinionated design patterns, really. And so you can take it or leave it. But I built a lot of these production dashboards, and let's dive into a little bit more about what's happening in this data pane so we can highlight some other issues that could come up to bite you that you can avoid up front by deliberately taking certain approach with your data pane. So let's crack open these original fields again. And we're going to notice here that I have, for my measures, I have this measures original base. Now, if we really looked throughout this dashboard, we would find that I never reference these fields. These raw fields that come into my data pane, into my data source, I like to keep a layer of separation between those raw fields and the rest of everything in the dashboard that depends on them. And that layer of separation is this base concept. So what I do here is I create a calculated field that just simply points to that raw field. And the reason I do this is twofold. For one, there could be some logic that just materializes in front of you as a business requirement down the road. Like maybe I have a lot of different columns in this data, dimensional columns, let's say, and one of these columns is some kind of flag. Like, for example, even though this has nothing to do with cryptocurrency, let's say something is like a flag that says this transaction was refunded. And maybe someone's looking at my dashboard, and before we put it into production, they say, "Oh, we actually need to remove certain types of refunds. Not all of them, but certain types." Well, then I could just easily come into this field that's looking at this this particular metric, and without applying a filter to everything in the dashboard, I could apply that filter specifically to this number just by editing and adding that logic into this formula. Now that's something that you can't do to a raw field. So if I right click on this, I can't edit this. So it's giving me this flexibility to be able to use this field, but then modify any dependency that uses this in one place by putting that logic into this formula. So that's one benefit. And very similar to that is this idea of your backend data potentially changing. So let's say that a data engineer responsible for feeding this data into my dashboard, or not necessarily responsible for feeding it into my dashboard, but maybe a data engineer who maintains the table that I'm using. What if they change the name of one of these columns? Maybe they have a really good reason to do it, but that could break things in my dashboard because I no longer have close price. It might be, close price all one word or lowercase. And, that may or may not automatically be fixed by Tableau on the next time I connect to that data. But one thing's for sure, if I have a layer of separation, then I don't necessarily have to rely on replacing references. I could just point to the correct field name, and then all the dependencies that point to close price base will have the correct reference. So another thing is, along that same end, if your backend data, what if you have a new column that comes in that changes the granularity of your data, and for some reason you can't pre-filter that before it hits your dashboard? This is just giving you, again, one extra defense against that. So all that to say, I really recommend don't just jump in and use the raw fields. Build some kind of shell variable, some shell calculated field that wraps around those raw fields. It's going to protect you, and it could take a bullet for you at some point in the future. All right, so one other thing I want to point out here is since we covered on the folder structure, we covered on not using raw fields directly, but there's also this thing I like to do with dates early on, which is this concept of making anchor dates. So let's just demo that really quickly, and then we'll wrap up this video. And in the next video, we'll really dive into the nitty gritty of starting to build out some of these more complex formulas for date comparisons. But what's this idea of anchor dates? So for starters, let's just group everything by folder. Let's take all of these measures that we're bringing in, and let's put these into measures original, so you can get a feel for what this kind of looks like when you start to build out your own data source. Let's also build dimensions original, and we're going to put symbol into dimensions original, and then time I'm going to put into a folder called dates original. I just like to treat dates differently than other dimensions, so we'll give it its own home. We'll put time in there, and now for all of these measures, or actually let's just do it for one, because I don't want to make you do. We could leave it as an exercise for you to do the rest of these, but let's just take close price and let's create a calculated field and call this close price base. And click OK. And now we want to create a new folder that's going to be measures original base. And so we can see this kind of process here of me spelling my folder wrong, of this process of starting to control the layout of our data source, so that as our dashboard gets more complicated, as we add more fields, everything has a home that it can belong in. And as we go, you'll notice I have many more folders here. As we move forward with this build process, if there isn't a folder yet for the type of thing that we're building, we will make that folder so that we keep things organized, we keep things maintainable. You might not even be you who's opening up this workbook in a month or two to edit it. It could be someone else. So that maintainability is going to be really crucial in making really good production grade dashboards. All right, so for this last thing I wanted to touch on, this concept of time, let's go ahead and create another folder, call this dates, original, and let's see, base. Also going to rename this. It's supposed to be just original. Okay, so my time base, I need to make that. And then I want to show you this, this idea of the anchor dates. So create a folder, dates/anchor. And what I want to do is I want to have dates that will always show me the minimum and the maximum date in my underlying data source. The reason for this will become really apparent in the next videos, but let me just show you what happens if we don't have an anchor date. Filters will impact that date. But if we do have an anchor date that's kind of locked into a level of detail calculation, that date will never change. It's always going to show us what our most recent date in the data source is and what our oldest date is, which is really useful for certain contexts. So let's build this. Let's create a calculated field. Let's call this time min, and this is going to be a level of detail calculation that we get by using these little curly brackets. And I'm going to just say, give me the minimum of my time base. All right, we're going to do this for the maximum as well. So time max, and we're going to do that same thing, but this time instead of minimum, we do maximum. And we're going to bring these out into a visual. We're going to make these exact dates so we can see what our earliest date is. Looks like 2020, and then what the maximum date, 2021. But now I'm also going to bring in without using a level of detail calculation, I'm going to bring in the minimum, and I'm going to bring in the maximum of my dates. And we're going to see how one of these gets changed by filters while the other does not. So one variety of these formulas, the ones down here in blue, these should be changing as I add in a time filter. Whoops, let's make this a date selection, range of dates. Okay, show this. And as I move this minimum to, like, let's say September 21st, down here we can see that now my minimum date that's not a level of detail calculation is showing September 21st. If I move this maximum back, we'll see that this date changes, but these up top, these time max, time min, those anchor dates, they never change. And this is something that's really desirable in a lot of situations. Only context filters, like if I change this to add to context, only context filters will impact these level of detail calculations. So, well, in general, there are nuances to that as well. But so I just wanted to show this because this is getting us into this territory where I'm trying to illustrate, we're not just using one time field. There are different ways we might want to use time. And as we start to build out a more complex data source, we don't just want to toss everything into some kind of folder that's like time or dates. We kind of want to give things more specific names because otherwise, instead of just having one folder that has 1,000 formulas in it, you're not doing that much better if you just have 3 folders that have 300 calculations. You kind of want things to be very modular so that when I click into this folder, I'm only seeing what I need. All right, so this is the introduction to how to set up a data source, how to set it up to where it's going to give you really good maintainability, so you keep things organized. And I recommend doing that by organizing your formulas into groups and folders, so it's grouped by folders. And then also protecting yourself by taking these raw fields that come in and never using those. Instead, you build some kind of placeholder that's simply pointing to the raw field, but that gives you the flexibility of a calculated field now that you could type additional logic into if you needed. So this sets the baseline for us to continue building up this data source in the next series of videos. So tune in the next one where we're going to dive into how you can actually start to build these time comparisons and build them in a very maintainable way to where if you realize you made a mistake, you can edit what needs to be edited, but you don't have to burn the whole house down to make your changes. So I hope you got something out of this video, and I'll see you next time.